Okay, folks. It's 2:05. I'm seeing one, two, three people here. I'm not sure what's going on. Um, I'll wait another minute and then I'm gonna start. All right, so you should be seeing my screen. You can let me know if you're not. So we're going to finish the microstructure of bone today and move on to fractures and then to the major bones of your skeletal system. But before we get to fractures, we're going to briefly discuss the influence of hormones on the structure of your bones, okay? Not a whole lot of information, but just enough to basically get your feet wet, as they say, right? So we're going to talk about two hormones here. One of them is calcitonin, and the other is parathyroid hormone. These are going to be important for controlling the rate of bone deposition as well as the rate of bone removal, okay? Now, generally speaking, as your blood calcium starts to rise, your thyroid gland is going to release a hormone called calcitonin, right? I'm hoping you all realize that calci looks like calcium, right? So calcitonin is going to be involved with calcium. And calcitonin stimulates, of course, no surprise, the deposition of calcium salts into your bone. So simply put, when you consume a meal high in calcium, your thyroid gland releases the calcitonin. And then the calcitonin causes the removal of the calcium from the blood and essentially sends it on its way to be deposited in the bone. Now, on the other hand, if your blood calcium level starts to fall, and remember why your blood calcium level is important. Right. Remember that calcium is involved in many, many different activities going on in your body at any given time. It's involved in the clotting of blood. It's involved in transmission of nervous impulses. It's involved in the transmission of muscle signals, etc. Right? So the calcium is extremely important. which is why you do not want the levels of calcium to significantly drop. Okay? At least not for any length of time. So once your blood calcium levels start to fall, that is where this hormone gets involved. This one is PTH, that stands for parathyroid hormone. Now, the parathyroid gland is basically embedded in your thyroid gland, okay? So you have both glands essentially right on top of one another. So it's easy for them to sense changes in blood calcium level and respond, right? Now, PTH causes osteoclasts to increase reactivity, okay? Now, just to remind everybody about osteoblast and osteoclast. When the calcitonin stimulates bone deposition, what it is really doing is activating osteoblasts. And the job of the osteoblast, of course, is to remove your calcium from the blood and pass that calcium on to the bones. Essentially, it is depositing the calcium, right? So your osteoblasts are depositing calcium in your bones. Now, when your blood calcium level is too low, on the other hand, the parathyroid hormone, as we said, will now trigger the osteoclasts to get involved. Osteoblasts, remember, stimulate bone deposition. But your osteoclast does the opposite. So as osteoclast activity increases, the osteoclasts essentially start melting furrows into your bone. Okay? And as they're melting these furrows into the bone, they're dissolving the calcium out of the bone and allowing it to go back to the blood. Okay? So the calcium osteoclasts essentially dissolve the bone to release the calcium. All right. So you can see here this diagram is showing how your body deals with changes in concentration of calcium in the blood, right? So this is basically summarizing what we just spoke about. So as you can see here, your normal blood calcium level is somewhere between 9 and 11 milligrams per 100 mils or deciliter. Now, as your calcium level rises in the blood, here's the thyroid gland. It releases that calcitonin. And then that calcitonin, of course, increases osteoblast activity, remember? And this increases the rate of deposition into your bones, okay? So calcitonin causes your bones to thicken, basically, right? On the other hand, now, if your blood calcium level starts to fall, that triggers now the release of parathyroid hormone from the parathyroid gland. And I want you to notice, this is the thyroid gland, remember that one is in the neck, right? So the anterior aspect of the thyroid gland, you can it looks like this. The posterior aspect of the thyroid gland, on the other hand, looks like this. And buried within this thyroid gland at the posterior end, you're going to have your parathyroid glands, okay? So your parathyroid glands are going to produce the parathyroid hormone. Remember, they are essentially embedded in the thyroid gland, right? And the parathyroid hormone increases the activity of osteoclasts. And osteoclasts, of course, start wearing away the bone and releasing calcium back into the blood, causing your blood calcium levels to rise. Now, that said, I'm assuming you're going to be familiar with some of these diseases of bones that I'm about to talk about, right? For example, everybody will learn about rickets at high school, right? Rickets basically is I'm referring to a condition in which your bones start to soften and become under mineralized, right? So they're under mineralized. There's not enough calcium to put into the bones, which is why they get softer. Now, rickets is associated with children, okay? So adults don't get rickets. Adults have another bone condition called osteomalacia, and it's almost identical to rickets, but it's not called thus, okay? So remember now, when you say rickets, we're talking about children normally. So without that calcium being put into the bone, as the child is growing, the bones are going to thin out, right? So if you think about it, as the child increases in height, his bones have to lengthen. And as the bones lengthen, you have to add more calcium to the bones to stabilize them. If your diet is very poor in calcium, what happens, of course, is that your bones are getting longer, but they're also getting softer because there's less and less calcium available. And because of the softening of the bones, over time, you can get the bones essentially starting to bend. And you then end up with bow legs and other deformities, right? Because the bones just bend under the weight of your body and the lack of calcium in them, right? Now, that said, we also associate this disorder with a lack of vitamin D. I'm hoping everybody remembers from CSEC, I keep calling back to CSEC, right? That one of the issues with calcium is calcium by itself is useless to you, okay? So let's say, for example, you decided, hey, you know what? Here are some limestone rocks. I'm just going to eat some because there's calcium in there, right? That's great. So you decide to eat a bunch of rocks. Or bird shells, by the way, bird shells are a very good source of calcium as well. So they enter your digestive tract and they're broken down. If you have very, very low levels of vitamin D, even if you get a massive input of calcium into your body, right? Without the vitamin D, the calcium literally cannot be removed from your digestive tract and it just stays there. So you're eating the calcium and all you're really doing is producing calcium-rich poop without the vitamin D, which is why, of course, normally when you look at let's say somebody's taking calcium supplements like Caltrate or what are these, when you read the ingredients, yes, it will say, hey, calcium, but normally the second most common ingredient is going to be vitamin D because the vitamin D is required for the calcium to be absorbed properly, okay? No vitamin D, all the calcium in the world is not going to change the fact that your bones are going to bend due to lack of calcium. Now, osteoporosis, this is another one. A lot of people consider this to be like an old person disease. And I mean, for the most part, that is true. But it is possible for young people also to get osteoporosis, even though it is, of course, as I said, rarer, okay? Now, as it mentions here, osteoporosis is not a single disease. It is a group of diseases, right? And the defining feature of this group is this. The rate at which your bone is losing calcium is greater than the bone at which calcium is being deposited in the bone, right? So that's all you have to do to have osteoporosis. You're removing bone from you're removing calcium from your bone faster than you're replacing it, and that's it. You have osteoporosis. Remember I said to you in class, females tend to get osteoporosis more often than males. This is due actually to estrogen. Estrogen in females is a trigger for the taking care of your bones, right? So estrogen activates osteoblasts, for example, and makes them act faster, taking out your dietary calcium and depositing it quickly. Without it, instead, you're going to end up now with the osteoblasts in the female work very slowly, very sluggishly. And because they're so slow and sluggish, they tend to not be able to keep up with the rate at which the bones are having the calcium pulled out of them. Okay? So hopefully that makes sense to you, right? So obviously, since males do not undergo menopause, the rate at which they have calcium deposition occurring will still slow, right? No one is immune to time, but they slow much less than what you expect to get from your female, right? So can males get osteoporosis? Absolutely, right? But it tends to occur much more often in females. And it also tends to be more severe in females as well, okay? Because males are still producing significant amounts of testosterone, which activate their osteoblasts, while females stop producing estrogen, which is what activates their osteoblasts, right? All right. Now, one of the signs of osteoporosis, of course, and the major one, is that the bones are so brittle that any significant exposure to even minor force can potentially cause the bones to shatter. And I do mean shatter, like you drop a ceramic pot or something on the ground, right? Just break it to pieces. Women have been known to be walking, and you know, if I walking downstairs, you're not quite paying attention, and you miss a step, right? And as you miss a step, then the step below it. I don't think any of it ever occurred to any of you that missing a step might be enough to actually cause your ankle bones just to break. That sounds ridiculous. But with osteoporosis, the bones are so fragile that something that simple will end up essentially putting a person into the hospital with severe fractures. Okay? As it mentions here, women have been known to sneeze, and the sneeze was hard enough to cause fractures. So at the end of the day, you don't want osteoporosis, okay? Now, let me leave this here. And we're going to go now to this. No, wrong one. We're going to talk now about types of fractures, right? Ways in which the bone can break. So we just finished mentioning poor grandma and her very, very brittle bones and how they can snap very easily because of how brittle they are, okay? So what we're going to do now is we're going to delve more deeply into that, as well as explain this thing here called Wolff's Law, right? Thankfully, Wolff's Law is very simple, very straightforward. I don't think any of you will have any problem understanding this, right? Here's the basic idea. When a bone is growing, okay, whichever part of the bone gets the most pressure put on it, that part of the bone gets the thickest. And that is basically what we're looking at here, right? So wherever the bone has the most force put on it, that is where the bone will become the thickest, essentially to resist that force. So that should make perfect sense to you, right? Because of course, this is where the bone is the most likely to break. So logically speaking, you do need to reinforce that part of the bone, right? Now it mentions here that long bones are thickest midway along the shaft. And if you think about, so this is like your femur. So you're walking around, and as you're stepping down, you're putting the weight of most of your body down on your femur, right? And this is saying halfway down the femur is where the bulk of that weight you're putting on the femur will actually lie, right? So in order to resist this weight, the femur is going to be thickest in the shaft midway down, right? And I'm sure that makes sense to everybody, right? Now, it also mentions that curved bones are thickest, of course, where they're also most likely to buckle. So simply put, one more time, Wolff's Law, when bones are growing, they get thickest in the part of the bone that is exposed to the most force, right? Now, this has implications, of course, for your humans on your day-to-day existence. Let's say, for example, you are an athlete, right? Let's say you do, I don't know, long jump. So when these people are doing a long jump and they're flying through the air and they slam feet first into that sand pit, the force of their body is going to be transmitted, of course, up their legs, right? And to some extent, their lower back. So it should make sense to you that these bones are going to thicken so that they can resist the force of the jumping and hitting the sand pit, right? Another simple way of looking at that, or an example, is this. When you see people bodybuilding at the gym, and you know these guys, professional bodybuilders, these big fit guys, as they're bodybuilding and working out and lifting heavy weights, their bones have to thicken to compensate for the weight that these people are lifting, right? And they have to thicken in the places where have the greatest stress. So for example, on your bone, you're going to have points of attachment for muscle. As a bodybuilder is doing his thing, the point of attachment for a bone to a muscle has to get bigger, right? So that the muscle can fit more comfortably around the bone and can pull on the bone more strongly. So because of that, you can actually have some idea as to the relative fitness of a person by actually looking at their skeleton. Because the point at which the muscle attaches to the bone leaves a little scar. So based on the size of the scar, you can tell how fit somebody was. So for example, using this method, scientists have been able to examine the skeletons of gladiators, right? And they were able to estimate how muscular your average gladiator was. I assume everybody knows that gladiators, right? So yeah, so it's a real thing here. The more pressure you put on the bone, the thicker it will get in that area, right? Now, as it says here, as you're putting mechanical stress on the bone, then the trabeculae, remember the trabeculae are found mainly in the spongy bone, and they help to make up the cavities in the spongy bone. It says they form along lines of stress, and large bony projections occur where heavy active muscle is attached. As we mentioned before, where when you attach the muscle to a bone, you're going to need a projection to make it easier for that muscle to attach. So the bigger the muscle is, the bigger the projection will be, and therefore, even after death, you can estimate how strong that person was, right? So this here is just showing you how a mechanical force is going to affect this bone. Now notice where the bulk of the mechanical force is going to be, right? Bulk of the mechanical force is going to be right here. So it should make sense to you that this area here is the thickest, right? And the idea is that the weight of your body is pressing down in this area, right? And then the reverberations, the force of you walking or coming up, also hitting this area. So the more force is being generated onto this little area right here, which is why it has to get this stick, right? Now that said, let's talk about how bones actually break, okay? So bone fractures, what do they look like when they break? Are there special ways in which bones can break? All of these things, right? Now, it mentions here that bones can be classified by the position of the ends of the bone after they break, which of course is a fracture, the completeness of the break, the orientation of the bones to the long axis. Are they twisted? Are they straight, right? Are they bent away from one another? And then, of course, whether or not the bone ends penetrate the skin, right? Now, see if this makes sense to you. If you break your bone and both ends of the bone stay in place, right? So it's like you break a pencil, but you just put enough pressure on the pencil to crack the pencil. Both halves might still be joined by an unbroken area, but there's definitely a break in that pencil. That would be a non-displaced break, okay? In a human being, is the same exact thing. You put enough force on the bone, eventually the bone will break, right? If you put just enough force to break the bone, the ends of the bone tend to stay in place. And that gives you a non-displaced fracture, okay? And generally speaking, if you had to have a fracture, you probably would prefer to get a non-displaced one. Because if the bones aren't separated, it's easier to realign them, put a cast on them, right? So there's a reason you prefer your fracture to be non-displaced. Now, with a displaced fracture, you've put so much force on the bone that not only have the ends broken completely away from one another, but they have shifted position. Now, this is gonna give you a warm time. Once you break the bone and the ends of the bone shift away from each other, it is difficult to align them in the field, which means you have to go back. Yeah, is the hospital you're going now, right? So you have to go to the hospital, and in the hospital has to put you in a traction apparatus. And if you've ever been in one of these things, you will not forget it, right? The idea here is that they have to align the bone properly, right? So the bone has shifted out of position, you have to put it back in position. So they strap basically cables to your, let's say you got a break in the leg. They'll strap cables to your leg and attach to what amounts to a pulley. And they will turn the pulley until the bones are pulled straight. And then at that point, they will allow them to they will allow the ends of the bones to grow back together and seal. Okay. Now, so that is displaced and non-displaced. Okay. Now we have complete and incomplete fractures. Now, here, please see if this makes sense to you. Your bone can break, but only in one part or several parts, but it still remains attached to the overall bone. Okay? So breaking the bone and that breakdown going all the way through is going to be an incomplete fracture. If the bone does break all the way through, that's a complete fracture. Okay? Now, obviously, an incomplete fracture is less likely to be displaced, whereas a complete fracture is easier for the ends of the bones to move away from one another and give you a displaced break, right? Okay. Then now we have what is called a linear fracture. This one here is tricky. In this kind of fracture, the fracture itself is following the direction of the bone. So if it's a long bone, the fracture is running lengthwise. Okay. Now the reason this kind of fracture is so bad is because as the fracture runs lengthwise, it means the actual break is going to be much larger than what you'd find going horizontally across. So this here, depending on how long the break is, can be a very, very serious kind of break, okay? So linear fractures go in the direction that your bone is going, okay? Now, in addition to that, you also have this kind of fracture called a transverse fracture. Now, remember what we just said too, linear fracture, the bone basically breaks across, lengthwise. So in a compound in a transverse fracture, the bone is going to break horizontally, right? So here's the basic idea. So this is your bone. So that's one broken end. That's another broken end. That there is a transverse fracture, okay? The fracture is essentially running left to right, right to left, doesn't matter. It's running horizontally. Now, this kind of break is probably the most common type of break you'll find, okay? This one here, you have, in order for it to heal properly, you're going to align the broken ends, right? And then allow the broken ends to get very, very close to each other. And then you're essentially going to put on the cast like that. The idea here is that you want the bone to be as close to its original position as possible. So when you put on that cast, right? So transverse fractures are not too bad to deal with because the actual surface area of the break is not huge, okay? Linear fractures now are a real pain in the butt. Remember, if it's linear, it's running in the direction of the bone. So let's say this is your bone here. Right? Let's pretend that's a bone. In a linear fracture, the break is actually going to run up the bone. So remember, a transverse fracture is horizontal. So it goes that way. The linear fracture is going this way. So you can end up with a giant crack, essentially, running down the shaft of the bone, which might not sound that bad. But here's the thing. That giant crack weakens the overall structure of the bone. And if you try to put any weight on this, it can actually cause the long bone to split lengthwise on you. And that is very bad, okay? Now, we can use these descriptions of fractures and actually put them together, right? For example, it mentions here, you can have something called a non-displaced compound fracture, for example, right? Or another way, we can say we have a displaced complete fracture. So if it's a displaced complete fracture, it means the bone is broken all the way in half, and then the ends have shifted away from one another, right? Or we can even have a non-displaced complete fracture, which the bone is once again broken completely in two, but the ends of the broken bone actually have not shifted. So they're still in alignment. I mean, that is a little less common because normally if you get hit with something hard enough to fracture your bone in the first place, it will tend to push the pieces out of alignment, right? All right, now compound is another group of terms here. For the most part, a compound fracture refers to one where the bones are poking up through the skin, right? So if you can see your bones, you have a compound fracture. And I'm sure it comes as no surprise to hear compound fractures are exceedingly dangerous. Exceedingly. Why is that? First of all, as the compound fracture breaks the bone, right? And obviously it has to be displaced because they couldn't puncture your skin if it wasn't displaced. So as this compound fracture, as the bits of bone shove up through your skin, they can tear surrounding blood vessels open and cause severe bleeding. So that, of course, can kill you. But not only that, even let's say that doesn't happen. There are no there are no severe bleeding incidents. Then again, I can't imagine you getting a compound fracture without some bleeding. But let's say you avoid major blood vessels, so you're not bleeding too badly. Once that bone sticks up out of your flesh, you have ripped yourself open and you have exposed yourself to all the pathogens in the air. All the infectious agents in the air can get into that wound and get deep into your body, right? So the chances of a compound fracture leading to infection are going to be much higher. Once you break that wound open, you're asking for trouble, right? So compound fractures, generally speaking, are going to be worse than simple fractures, right? Now, simple fractures are not fun, don't get me wrong, because you can still have a displaced simple fracture, right? Well, first of all, let's just remind ourselves what a simple fracture is. Simple fracture, opposite of a compound fracture, as in the parts of the bone stay under the skin. So if you break your bone and you can't see the bone, chances are you have a simple fracture. But if you see the bone, you have a compound fracture, okay? Now, let's just review real quick. We said we had displaced and non-displaced fractures, where if the bone stays in place, when it has broken, we call it a non-displaced fracture. But if it shifts out of position, we call it a displaced fracture. We then have complete and incomplete, where if your bone breaks all the way through, you basically get at least two halves, two parts, I should say. That is complete. Whereas if the bone bends on one side, breaks on the other side, or if the fracture is caused by something sticking into the bone, let's say for example somebody gets stabbed in the humerus, the knife is going to penetrate the bone and crack the bone, but it's not going to cut the bone in two, so that would be an incomplete fracture, right? So remember, complete fractures break all the way through. Incomplete fractures do not break all the way through. Then now we have linear fractures and parallel fractures. A linear fracture runs along the long axis of a bone, right? And it can be very, very difficult to treat because you have to pin this one up, right? And remember, please, we can use any of the terms from before and pair them together. So, for example, you can have a non-displaced, incomplete linear fracture. So we could have a non-displaced, incomplete linear fracture. What does this tell me? It tells me the two ends of the bones are still where they're supposed to be. It tells me the bone is not broken all the way through. And it tells me the break is long ways, okay? Apologize for eating. I haven't had breakfast. Now, transverse fracture, another way, runs across the bone, right? So as it says here, it is perpendicular to the axis of the long bone. And once again, you can use multiple terms to describe a fracture. So you can have a transverse, complete, displaced fracture. Transverse, complete, displaced fracture. Basically, it means the bone is completely broken into two pieces and the pieces have shifted position, right? Or as I like to think of it, the traffic accident fracture. You must have seen like videos on YouTube or on Facebook or what's it you people use these days, not Facebook. The stupid one that sounds like a clock. TikTok. I'm sure you if you go on TikTok, you can find people posting images of horrible breaks that people have had. I actually advise you to go do that. You really should go on your TikTok, look up fractures. The reason I'm asking you to do this is I want you to try and identify the fractures based on what you're seeing, right? So based on how we're describing how a fracture could be, I want you to be able to say, look at a break and say, okay, these are the characteristics of the break. And you're going to tell me them, right? Because, of course, what I just described to you makes excellent questions for multiple choice, right? Now, also, remember, we have compound and we have simple. A simple break stays within the skin. Compound break, the bones stick out of the break, stick out of the skin, right? Easy as that. Now, with all of this in mind, we also have some, let's call them specialized type of fractures. We can still use these terms to describe these fractures, right? So don't forget that. These terms are still all valid for the special ones. But because of the, how can I put it? Because of the frequency that doctors and nurses come into contact with these kinds of breaks, they just give them special names. For example, the first one here is the comminuted fracture. Let me ask, are any of you interested in any kind of geriatric medicine? You know what I mean by geriatric medicine? Anybody?
Treating old people?
Uh-huh. Y'all interested in doing anything like that?
No.
Mm-mm.
No, sir, not really.
Okay, I hate to break it to you, but there's a whole heap of doctors in Jamaica. There are very few geriatric specialists. Geriatric specialists that make money can done. Because treating a very old person is not the same as treating an average age person. Average age in Jamaica is about 20, what was it? 26, 27, something like that, right? So treating somebody who's 26 for an illness is not the same as treating somebody who's 86. There's a lot of money in geriatric medicine. And I strongly advise you to consider that, right, when you're specializing. Anyway, that's just my thought. Now, but eventually if you're a doctor, eventually some old person will come in, I'll mash up. It's inevitable. One of the most common types of fractures you find in old people are going to be comminuted fractures. Remember what we were saying about osteoporosis? What makes the bone very brittle, right? So it breaks easily. But let me add to that and say this. Not only does the bone break easily, the bone actually shatters easily. Okay? I do mean literal shatter. Comminuted fracture can literally have the bone breaking into 6, 7, a dozen pieces. So that the surgeon has to go in, cut the wound open, and they have to be essentially not really a puzzle, it's more like what I call it, the Lego. They have to be putting together the people them bones like Lego pieces, right? So obviously, that kind of fracture is extremely difficult to fully treat. Right? You're pulling out bone debris and bits and pieces of bone. Then you have to decide, boy, can you save this? Can you pin these pieces together and somehow make something functional? Or do you just take out the whole thing and then try and find some sort of artificial bone to put in place? It's a very interesting thing, okay? Anyway, if you do old people, you're going to come across these kind of fractures, right? Let me give you an example here. I have an image I'm going to show you. As I said, it is so common in old people. You're just gonna need to, once you see an old person come in and they've broken their bone, you just assume this is the kind of fracture they have. So this is a comminuted fracture of the femur, right? Now, I want you to notice just how broken up this bone is. Keep in mind, this lady probably just tripped and went down on one knee. And the force of the trip and go down on one knee would have been enough to shatter the bone into, well, this one is not so bad. We have one piece here, two pieces here. There's a third one. Of course, we have the end of the bone here, 4. Then we have another one here, 5. Right? That's only 5 pieces. That could be worse. And look what they had to do to put this back together. They had to shove a metal rod down into the medullary cavity, right? And then pin the rod through the 2 ends of the femur. And then after they do that, they had to bring the bits and pieces of broken bone around now the metal rod close enough and hope that the bone starts to heal itself and then the broken pieces get stitched back together, right? You can imagine how many hours this surgery would have taken. So yeah, comminuted fractures are not a joke. They are very, very terrible, right? Oh, it's a female. I didn't even notice. Anyway, now the next kind of fracture that you might, well, I don't know if you've ever heard of this. If you all play any kind of sports, this is a very, very common sport fracture. This is a spiral fracture, right? Let me give an example of what I'm talking about. I don't know if any of you have ever played like football before, and girls can play football. There's nothing wrong with that. But one of the things that can happen to you is this. Let's say you're playing, you and another person running after the ball, both of you trying to kick at the ball. The other person kicks the ball flies away, you miss. And as you miss, your body twists with the force of you kicking at the ball, right? And as you twist with that force of you kicking the ball, that twisting force also causes your leg bones to twist as well. And as your leg bones twist, they actually can just break. So this here is a spiral fracture. So it is the equivalent of taking a pencil and grabbing the ends of the pencil and just twisting the pencil until it splits into pieces, right? Or taking a roll-up piece of paper and twisting it. Well, I mean, obviously, paper won't break, but you get the idea. So here now you can see that the ends of the bone are twisted until they have broken apart. But this, of course, is a young, healthy adult, right? And because of that, you'll notice that the bone has not shattered into many pieces. You only have 2 pieces here. So this is actually a lot easier to treat than your comminuted fracture. Because realistically, these 2 ends of bone will fit nicely back into each other. You can run a pin through it. I mean, you might actually put a rod in there as well, but probably not. It's a bit close to the end of the long bone. So you might just put a couple of pins through this, put them in a cast. 6 weeks from now, they'll be fine, right? So that one is not too bad. Then now we also have a kind of fracture called a compressed fracture. I think it's compressed comes next, right? Or a depressed fracture, sorry. In a depressed fracture, the idea here is that you get hit so hard, right, that the force of the assault pushes bone into itself, right? So this here is the head of somebody who unfortunately got hit with I think this is a glass bottle, I think they said. Now I think I'd mentioned to you before that the idea about you're watching movies and you see people getting hit over the head with a bottle, and how in the movies the bottle just breaks and the person knocks out and then 10 minutes later they wake up back. That does not happen in real life. All right. Javier, you have a question?
Yes, sir. Wait, what happens to the rods after the bone heals?
They stay.
Whatever.
You can't take them out. Remember now, the good thing is that the medullary cavity just has fat in there, right? So because of that, you don't pull the rods. You just leave them in there. Which I mean, let's be honest, that's probably for the best. It does help to stabilize. What they will do is they'll pull the pins out. So for example, you have these pins here. After 6 weeks or so, the pins get pulled out, right? But you, generally speaking, I mean, the only way to get the rod back out would be to cut the bone and take it out, which defeats the whole purpose, right?
Yeah, that's the wrong thing. I meant the pins.
Oh, the pins. Yeah, man, those come out. At least they're supposed to. There have been cases. I remember this one case a few years, a while ago now, where this person broke their bone, and years before went to the whole process, then had the pins so-called removed. But the doctor at the time didn't pull all the pins for whatever reason, we don't know. But the guy about 15 years later had to go and get a CT scan, right? And you know those CT scan machines that generate a massive magnetic field, right? So my guy lies down in the CT scan machine, they turn on the machine, and all of a sudden he feels this enormous pain ripping at his leg. The CT scan machine was trying to pull the pin that he didn't know was there out of his leg, right? So yeah, they're supposed to come out. Also, if you go into like airport security and you try to go through, it'll set off the security. But also the rod in your leg will also set off security as well. So normally what happens is that this is what I'm told, that when people have these permanent rods in their legs and they're traveling, they have to get like a note from their doctor indicating why they're setting off the metal detectors. Sounds slightly annoying, but you know, what can you do, right? All right. So as I said, this fellow here just got introduced to a bottle. Now, this is the skull, okay? And the reason this is called a depressed fracture is because he got hit so hard with the bottle, it forced this part of his skull into his brain, right? So I want you to remember here, this where his skull is supposed to be. Let me go back to full screen. Just to remind you, this is where his skull is supposed to be, right? And this is where it is. So he would have gotten hit hard enough to push his skull down onto his brain tissue and cause brain damage. Okay? I'm not sure if this person survived. So that is your depressed fracture, right? So a part of the bone is forced in on itself. Then now, the next one we're going to look at now is your compressed fracture. This one is a little different from the depressed fracture. So remember, the depressed fracture, you're forcing parts of the bone inwards. In a compressed fracture, you're actually squeezing the bone so hard that the bone breaks, right? So you're squeezing the bone so hard, the bone actually just breaks. So that's a compressed or a compression fracture. This happens a lot with the vertebra, right? And this can be a serious issue as well. Y'all know what parkour is, right? I see everybody's heard the term parkour. You know, when they're running around jumping off buildings and stuff, you know, for whatever reason. Now, it should come as no surprise to you that sometimes when you're jumping from building to building, you occasionally miss your jump. And when you miss your jump, you have a problem. Because usually it means you're going to fall, right? And if you fall and decide you're going to fall feet first, right? And you just hit the ground feet first, you don't roll to absorb the impact or anything like that. You just jump and drop, boof. Think you're Superman. The force of the you hitting the ground runs up your spine, gets to the vertebra, and actually can cause your vertebra to crush inwards on itself, right? So the vertebra gets partially flattened. Now, if you look here, so you can see how this vertebra here looks narrower than the ones below it and above it, because it gets squashed like a marshmallow sort of thing, right? And of course, when that happens, you're going to damage not just the bone, not just the cartilage, you're also going to end up damaging potentially not just blood vessels as well as nerves, right? This is also to show you it's in a little easier to see this. So you can see here the broken bone and the compressed vertebra, okay? So it is damaging now your nerve fibers potentially. So that means that this break here, even when it heals, right? There might be permanent debilitating impacts from this. So be mindful, running around, jumping off of high buildings might not be the safest thing in the world to do from the perspective of your bone health, okay? But that said, there are lots of extreme sports and people do their extreme sporting thing. So who are we to judge, right? For example, I mean, would you consider drag racing to be an extreme sport? No, probably not. But so many people do drag racing lose control of the vehicles and end up smashing into things. And of course, their bones suffer greatly for that, right? So from that perspective, I guess you could say it's an extreme sport. Now, we're going to move on now, and we're going to talk now about fractures that are most common in what I would say would be young people. So young people, and when I say young people, I generally speaking, I'm talking about people below the age of 20 usually, right? And those two types of fractures, the two most common fractures of young people, are what we call a green stick fracture and the epiphyseal fracture, right? So green stick and epiphyseal. Now, if I say green stick, I mean, why are we calling a fracture after a stick? It sounds kind of stupid. But I mean, you've all been children before. And as children, you've all gone outside, and for whatever reason, you've pulled a stick off of a tree. Well, I'm assuming, and you have taken the stick and pulled all the leaves off the stick and start running around whipping things with the stick. I'm sure you all have done it, or some variation on that. And eventually the stick breaks. And when the stick breaks, it doesn't just fall into two pieces, does it? It hangs over, right? So a green stick fracture is like that. The bone is not going to break completely into two pieces. So it is going to be an incomplete fracture, right? And during the process of the incomplete fracture occurring, the bone itself will actually bend as well, just like, a green stick. So that said, I'll get back to that one in a second. Let's do epiphyseal one first. Remember I said to you, you have the epiphyseal plate in people who are still growing. And the plate contains cartilage. Once again, sorry about eating. The plate contains cartilage. And in order for you to get taller, the cartilage thickens, as you know, and then the bottom part of it turns to bone. It thickens some more, and the bottom part turns to bone again, right? Oversimplification for our purposes we'll work with. Now, if a child gets hit hard enough, right, what will happen is that the cartilage at the epiphyseal plate can actually tear, and essentially it's possible for it to rip right off. Because remember, it is cartilage, it's not bone. Cartilage is very soft. So a child gets into a car accident or something, gets hit, and basically you can just rip the knee joint into bits and pieces. It basically just tear the knee joint open. Okay. So what we're seeing here is a pin that has been placed through the epiphyseal cartilage. So here's the pin. Here's the epiphyseal cartilage here, so to hold the end of the epiphysis of the long bone onto the diaphysis. So they've pinned the epiphysis and the diaphysis together because it ripped off during the accident, okay? Now, what should happen is that the cartilage ends should rejoin over time. And then after a period of, honestly, children, they're like weeds, you know? Once you don't kill them immediately, they usually recover and quickly. So within like, honestly, like 4 weeks time to 6 weeks time, you can pull these out. And then usually they're okay, okay? Usually they're okay. But here's the thing. Remember that the epiphyseal plate is where you have growth occurring. If you damage the epiphyseal cartilage enough, you can slow down the rate of growth at the epiphyseal cartilage. And when that happens, you end up with a child with one, in this case, one limb growing faster than the other limb. So, you know, by the time they're an adult, they're limping because their left leg is a couple centimeters longer than their right leg, because the left leg was growing more slowly because of the damage. And then you see they have to put on special shoes and all sorts of things, right? So that is the epiphyseal plate damage. So epiphyseal fracture, the epiphyseal plate tears away from the bone partially or completely, right? Leading to the epiphysis and the diaphysis separating. All right. So as I said, very common in young children. And the younger the child is, remember, the thicker the plate is going to be. Now, green stick fracture. So obviously this child, I'm hoping you're, oh, by the way, if you look here, right? You can see how underdeveloped the bones are in the wrist. Right? Lots of spacing in between. This is a very young child. Right? This is a toddler. I'd love to know how they managed to break his arm. You know what? It could be simple, something simple as, have you ever heard that you kind of, sometimes you see people grab babies and pick them up by their arms? You know, just grab an arm and lift them up. You're not supposed to do that. Right? I mean, one would think it was obvious, but you're not. Or sometimes you see people pick up a baby and swing them around, like by one hand. And I'm sure half of you are like, why would you do that to a baby? People do it, right? So in the midst of, let's say they're playing with a baby, and you know, they forget that baby is a baby and they can't take force. You put too much force on the arm. The bones of the arm start to bend, as you can see here. But because the bones of these children are very soft in comparison to those of adults. Why? Because their bone has a lot of osteoid. Remember, the osteoid is the biological part of the bone or organic part of the bone that makes it very flexible, and they don't have a lot of hydroxyapatite. So because of that, the bone wants to bend. And if you continue to put force on the bending bone, the bone will break on one side. That's why for each of these here, you can see there's a break on one side of the bone, okay? And once that bone breaks, it simply continues to bend on the other side. It does mean, of course, that young children are less likely to get complete fractures because of this green stick effect. Which, of course, if you think about it, is a good thing, right? And the good thing, and the even better thing is this. Because the children's bones are so soft at this stage, they heal extremely quickly, right? An adult would be in a cast for all 6 months, 8 months. You know, a 4-year-old, give him 3 to 6 weeks, he's up and around again, right? I mean, literally, could be as little as 3 weeks because of how rapidly their bones heal. Now, hopefully that makes sense, right? Once again, this is not an excuse to go breaking up children because they heal faster. But it does mean that as you get older, your ability to recover from damage to your bones diminishes, right? Hopefully that makes sense to you, right? So when you're young, that is the time to go full round. For example, when I was 8 years old, one of the things we love to do is climb to the top of our house and just jump off for the hell of it. Climb a tree, just jump out of the tree. It never even occurred to you at that age that you could, break something. And of course, most of the time you don't, right? I remember running down hills at breakneck speed, tripping over rocks, and just bashing into stuff. And just brush off yourself and you go home. You know? Why? Because your bones are so soft when they get hit by an impact, as long as it's not an extreme impact, they just flex and absorb the impact. And your body mass is so small relative to your size, it more easily absorbs that impact. As I sometimes these people talk about, oh, children just drop them in the bones all over the place, they'll be fine. I mean, yes, there is some truth to that, right? Anyway, hopefully that makes sense to you, right? So the two most common types of fracture of children, epiphyseal fracture, where the epiphyseal plate splits, right? Green stick fracture, where the bone bends enough until it breaks on one side. Whereas common fracture of adults, we're looking at comminuted, spiral, depressed, and compression fractures. Okay. All right. By the way, have any of you ever broken a bone? I should have asked. Anybody ever gone through that?
A fracture.
Fracture? Can you describe the fracture? Based on what we said, can you describe the fracture?
I don't remember the X-ray, but I think it was incomplete.
Okay, but the bone wasn't sticking out, right?
No.
Okay, so we're looking at an incomplete. Was it in a long bone? So arm bone, leg bone? Or is that the wrist?
No, I'm a big toe.
On your big toe?
Yeah.
So you kick something. All right.
No.
More than likely that was going to be that's a compressed. Okay, here's how I would describe that fracture. See if it makes sense to you. It wasn't sticking out, right? And since you got it by striking, we're assuming you got it by kicking something. Because children are forever kicking things, right? So more than likely, it was a compression fracture, right? It would have been non-displaced. A non-displaced, more than likely incomplete, simple fracture. Because the bone didn't break into multiple pieces, right? The bone itself didn't seem to move out of alignment more likely than not. It stayed within the skin. Therefore, that's why I would describe your fracture as thus. Okay? All right. Now,
Sir,
yes.
does the order that you described it in matter?
Come again?
Does the order that you describe the fracture in matter?
I mean, realistically, the information is more important than the order. When you go to med school, they're going to be a little bit more strict with that sort of thing. But for our purposes, as long as you have the appropriate words, I don't care about the order. But once again, med school people do them thing different, right? Now, let's talk about how the bones actually heal. Okay. I have a meeting at 4, so I have to leave at 3:30. So sorry about that. I have to leave about 15, 20 minutes early. Now, when you actually break a bone, okay, and I've never broken a bone before, but I have had well, that's not true. I have broken a bone once, right? It was a finger. One of my the digits of my finger broke and was displaced. I was about 8 or 7. What basically you know, when I was growing up, you know, if you have children and this is over the summer, your mother busy, she just take you, put you outside and say come back later. Right? That's how I grew. So we'd be in the neighborhood, and of course, all the kids are put out at approximately the same time of day. So you'd congregate together, and of course, being children, you find mischief. And one of the things that we used to do is we had a hill at the back of where we lived. So this one genius found a sheet of zinc and pulled the sheet of zinc up to the top of the hill. I would jump on the sheet of zinc and would slide down the sheet of zinc all the way down to the bottom of the hill, which was, of course, a pile of rocks. And of course, we thought it was great fun just sliding on the sheet of zinc, sliding on the sheet of zinc. Never once occurred to anybody that maybe sliding down what amounts to a sharp sheet of metal slamming into sharp rocks at the base of a hill that was about 70 feet and an angle of about 30 degrees is not a great idea. So eventually, of course, I hit a stone the wrong way coming down, flew off of the zinc, put my hands out to catch myself, and of course, my finger caught between 2 rocks and it went quick. So carried the hospital, and they put my finger in a cast, right? And the reason I don't remember it very well is because it wasn't in the cast very long. Talking about like 3 weeks and the cast was gone. So yeah, to this day, I can't remember what it felt like. Because some people tell you that when you break a bone, you don't actually feel the bone break. Okay? Because it's almost as if you immediately go into shock. So the bone, so that's brack, you know, you hear the sound brack, you're like, what's that? And then only when you try to move that part of your body, do you all of a sudden feel the incredible pain. Joy, some people tell you that, boy, they have broken bones and they didn't even realize the bones were broken until later. Right? So it is a thing. Okay. So immediately after the bone breaks, remember that your bone has lots of blood vessels running through it. Right? You have lots of blood vessels in the osteon canals. And the Habergeon systems, they all have blood vessels running through them. So when you break a bone, this, for example, is a transverse fracture, right? Well, let's describe this fracture. It's a transverse fracture because it goes across. It goes all the way across, so it's complete. Right? And the ends are not sticking out to the body. So this is simple. So this is a simple transverse complete fracture. Okay? So this fracture has broken all these blood vessels. And these blood vessels, of course, once they tear open, the blood leaks into the damaged area. It leaks into the space between the 2 bones. And once this happens, you're going to start clotting that blood that is in this space now. So your platelets are going to start going crazy, releasing clotting factor, and you end up with this large mass of clotted blood in the area of the break called a hematoma. Okay? So anytime you have a large mass of clotted blood in a damaged area, we call it a hematoma. Hema, of course, as in blood, right? So this hematoma, remember, is a mass of clotted blood. The hematoma itself is going to stop further bleeding, which is good. But it is not structural in the least. And it normally happens within less than an hour of the break occurring, right? So within less than an hour of the break occurring, you get the hematoma formation. But because the hematoma is not structural, any attempt to move this part of the body can actually rip the hematoma open and cause bleeding to occur even more. And the swelling of all the blood in that area sensitizes your pain receptors. So trying to move the area is extremely painful because, of course, your body doesn't want you to move that part of it because the hematoma is trying to stabilize the bleeding. So it hurts like nobody's business when they try to move it, right? Now, after you form the hematoma, over a period of a few days, right, you're going to convert now that hematoma into what is called a soft callus. Right? The soft callus is made up of cartilage. So you're going to have chondrocytes. These are the cells that make the cartilage moving into the hematoma and starting to form the cartilage, especially between the ends of the bone. The reason for that, of course, is to hold the ends of the bone more stably in place. The hematoma doesn't do anything for stability. And as you're making the cartilage and the blood vessels that have been broken open are able now to grow back together while this is happening and fix themselves. So you now have a stabilized cartilage within the wound with blood vessels, I should say, running through it, right? And capillaries, of course, will grow through it as well. As it says, this takes several days. Once again, this is not super stable either. So at this stage here, the damaged area is more stable, but you still cannot put any real weight on it because it's just cartilage. A significant amount of weight, you will just break through the cartilage. But it's, of course, much stronger than the hematoma, okay? Now, I'm hoping you realize why when somebody breaks a bone, we have to put them in a splint, and then from a splint, put them in a cast. Because you have to try your best to ensure that the bone does not move. So when somebody breaks a bone and you put a splint around the broken area, immediately to prevent the ends of the bone from shifting around and breaking the hematoma open so bleeding continues. So it is very important to splint a person with a serious break, okay? Then now you get them to the hospital, right? Once you've aligned the bones, the hematoma starts to be converted to a fibrocallus. At that stage, now you put the cast around the bone, right? Because there's a little bit more stability in there, yes, but you still cannot allow for any pressure in the area. That is why the cast doesn't just go over the broken area. The cast has to continue the length of the bone, and it normally ends below the joint, right? And if in extreme cases, it even goes above the joint. The idea here is to allow for your body's weight, in case you accidentally put any weight down on it, to be taken by the entire length of the bone and not putting too much pressure on the broken area. But even with that, people who have broken their legs, for example, can tell you, even after they put on the cast, they can't walk on it. Right? It hurts like hell. Right? But it still prevents the bones from shifting away from each other, which of course would tear up the callus and cause more bleeding and the whole process to start over. Now, as you're forming the callus from cartilage, remember, fiber cartilage, which is the strongest cartilage. Any bits and pieces of broken bone that are left in there, any debris will be cleaned up. Right? So they're removing bits and pieces of bone and dead tissue and all kind of things. So that when now they move to the next stage, which is the formation of a bony callus versus a soft callus, remember, then they will not interfere with the formation of this new bony callus. In the bony callus, you're replacing now your cartilage with actual bone. And it starts out as spongy bone with trabeculae growing in through the cartilage, right? And then, of course, going around the blood vessels, as we know. And at this stage now, which takes about 3 to 4 weeks, that callus is hard enough now that you can actually start to put pressure on it, okay? So let's say, for example, you broke your femur. Normally at this stage, you go back to the hospital and they would cut off the original cast and they will put something on you called a walking cast. So you can move around more easily with the cast on, all right? Because you're no longer worried about the bone shifting position at the break. So you want to allow now for movement. As a matter of fact, they want you to put some amount of pressure on the bone at this part, okay? Which sounds ridiculous. The bone isn't healed yet, so why are you putting pressure on it? When you have a break like this, once the break has stabilized and you have formed a proper bony callus, putting some amount of weight on the area actually speeds up the rate at which your bone heals. So when somebody has a broken limb, they can't just not use that limb and say, oh, I'm just going to wait for it to heal. If you do that, it will heal very poorly, right? It will heal in a weak way. So that if you put excess pressure on that bone later on, it might break again, right? So it is important that once you break your bone, after the first month, you start to put pressure on the break. Because as you do that, the bony callus will get denser and stronger. And over the period of 2 to 3 months, so this thing takes a while, you will be left now with a very strong healed section, right? Now, you can see here that the bony callus itself is kind of a mess. Why can't I go back? What I mean when I say it's kind of a mess, you'll see here bits and pieces of bone protruding on either side of the break, right? So it's kind of a mess. So those bits and pieces is protruding out here. That's the leftovers of the bony callus forming. You really don't want them there. And if you, once again, you know anybody who's ever broken a bone, when you run if you hand over the area of the break, sometimes you'll feel a lump. And that is the excess bone that was produced by them during the formation of the bony callus. And that lump can be there for years, right? But over time, the area will get smoothed out. So the lumpiness will go away as your osteoclasts wear away at the bone to make it smooth again. Now, that said, even after it's fully healed, which, as I said, you can move around on the bony callus and you'll be fine and you'll strengthen it over time. But the remodeling phase can take months to years to finally finish. Now, the area of the break, right, generally speaking, will heal denser than the surrounding bone. So when you break this area and it fixes itself, it tends to fix itself stronger than the surrounding bone. So the likelihood of you breaking your bone in the exact same place again is lowered. So breaking a bone, letting it heal, tends to make the bone stronger. Okay. Now, this is actually the reasoning behind some martial arts. You all must have seen like Shaolin Kung Fu and those kind of things, right? One of the things that you'll see they do sometimes is that they'll take like a big cauldron or something, fill it with sand, and spend the whole day punching the sand. Why are they punching sand? As they hit the sand over and over and over again, it causes microfractures to occur in their knuckles and in the bones of their fingers. And every time they get these microfractures, and the microfractures heal over, the microfractures heal stronger than the original bone. So by doing this over and over and over again, the bones of their hands get stronger and denser, which is why you can see them punching boards and bending iron bars with their fist and all kind of nonsense. It's not a trick. They've just worked their bones until their bones get so dense and so strong, they can punch a cinder block and break it. Okay? Also,
So,
by
sir,
doing,
you're
yes, go ahead.
so sir, saying that video with, I think it was with Bruce Lee when he broke. I think what did he do? I think he broke a board or something like that, and he did it in seconds. So that is because I didn't really believe it at first, but from what you're explaining, you're basically saying it's actually true.
Yeah.
Okay.
Right? Even Bruce Lee's I don't know. Bruce Lee is one of the few quote unquote actors that was the real deal. All right. I don't know if you noticed, but one of the things that Bruce Lee used to do while he was making movies, he had an open door policy. Any martial artist could come and challenge him to a fight. Right? He'd fight anybody. And of all the fights, Jackie Chan. He fought Jackie Chan one time and beat Jackie Chan senseless in a couple of seconds. Right? And Jackie Chan is a good fighter. He beat at the time the American judo champion in no time. So Bruce Lee was the real deal. And he did this kind of thing. He would practice striking hard objects over and over and over again with his fists to make his bones exceedingly strong. Right?
Yes,
there was
I
a
understand.
I think it's Enter the Dragon when somebody took up a brick and punched the brick and broke the brick with a thing. So just hold a brick and punch it and break it. You can do that. If you train enough, that's a thing that can be done. Right?
Yes, sir.
So yeah. That said, it's a very painful process. Right? And it takes years. You have that kind of commitment, God bless you. Right? Anyway. So at the end of all of this, as I said, over a period of years, your bone will smooth out, but in the area of the break, it will always be denser and stronger than the surrounding bone. So the likelihood of your bone breaking again in this exact same position is very, very low because of that, okay? All right, we spoke about rickets earlier and osteoporosis. All right, so we'll speak about bone surface markings on Thursday. So we'll stop for now. So I have to leave about 10 minutes early. All right, folks, have a good rest of your afternoon. By the way, I'm having issues with Moodle and loading. I was hoping to load up lectures on Moodle, but it will not accept lectures this size. It will only take lecture 70 megabytes or less, which is tiny. So I'm gonna try and figure out if we can do that on Canvas. And on Thursday, I'll give you the Canvas link for the A&P, okay? All right, folks, have a good rest of your day.